Welcome back to BetterHelp's In Session series. My name is Hesu Jo, and I'm a licensed therapist and part of the clinical operations team here at BetterHelp. This Friday, on November 11th, is Veterans Day. This is a day not only to honor those who have fought courageously, but also to empower our nation's heroes through their transition back into civilian life. That's why we're so excited to be joined today by some of our social impact partners who are doing just that. Today, we're in session with Mike Kenny and Sid Ellington. Mike is a graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point and retired from the U.S. Army in 2015 as a Special Forces Lieutenant Colonel with over 22 years of service to the nation. He's now the executive director at Warriors Ascent, which is a nonprofit 501c3 organization based in Kansas City, Missouri, founded and run by veterans to help veterans, service members, and first responders who are struggling with post-traumatic stress. Their 5-day program, run 6 to 8 times a year, provides their attendees the tools they need to heal and tend the mind, body, and soul. Sid Ellington is a retired Navy SEAL officer and a professor of practice in the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Oklahoma, where he teaches courses in nonprofit and non-governmental organizations. He is a gubernatorial appointee to the Oklahoma State Department of Veterans Affairs Board of Commissioners, and he also serves as a strategic advisor for the Courage Foundation. Similar to Warriors Ascent, the Courage Foundation's mission is to foster post-traumatic growth, restore purpose, and transform lives through integrative self-awareness, physical health, mental toughness, emotional resilience, and spiritual well-being. Courage Foundation educates, equips, and empowers veterans living with PTS with the skills, resources, and training to thrive. BetterHelp has also partnered with the Courage Foundation to provide 53-month therapy vouchers to members of their program, and with Warriors Ascent to provide 150 3-month therapy vouchers to their attendees. Firstly, thank you both so much for coming on to speak today. Sadly, most of us are not strangers to hearing the staggering mental health statistics surrounding soldiers and veterans. For example, a study shows that the rate of major depression is 5 times as high among soldiers compared to civilians, and post-traumatic stress disorder was nearly 15 times higher than among civilians. Hearing this, there's clearly a need for more support for our veterans. What's truly remarkable about both of your organizations is that you're really focused on not only changing the narrative around how we talk about vets, but also really focused on holistic healing. So I'm wondering if you wanted to share a bit more about how you got involved with these important organizations and what it means to you to be part of their missions.
I'll go ahead first, then. Thanks, Mike, and Hesu Jo. Thanks so much for having us on the podcast. This is really incredible and much appreciated. I have been bouncing around the nonprofit space in serving veterans with different organizations since I retired from the military. And after Mark Divine published his book, Staring Down the Wolf, I got reconnected with him. And he said, "Hey, I've got this nonprofit I started, and I could use some help with it." And Mark and I had been friends and former teammates since the early 1990s back in California. It's in the San Diego area. And so I was very happy to jump in and lend a hand where I could. And so that's basically how I got reconnected with Seal Fit and Unbeatable Mind, which are his for-profit companies, and then his the Courage Foundation, which is the nonprofit arm. Mark Divine's whole philosophy is master yourself and serve others. And so that's the basic approach that he uses with the Courage Foundation to bring veterans back into civilian society and help them transition. As you well know, and Mike is absolutely aware, there is some 200,000 veterans every year that are transitioning back into civilian society. And this is a generation, this post 9/11 generation of veterans, has spent 20 years in sustained combat, and it's the first time we've had an all-volunteer force, and the first time that we've had women serving roles in combat arms. So when you consider that, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, it was all about the draft. These folks have served, come home, gone back, come home, gone back, until either they spend 20 years in that role, or they decide to go ahead and exit the military because it's just too much. And you put that kind of trauma on anybody, and then you consider that, with today's society, I can speak, to the state of Oklahoma, where such a large percentage of our Oklahoma children, grow up experiencing childhood trauma. And so, they enter Oklahomans in this case, enter the military service, go to combat, and sustain trauma on top of trauma. And so that's quite an adjustment, coming back into, civilian society. But what they've left service with are some amazing skills and attributes that have been honed during their time wearing the nation's cloth. And that includes, they're team builders, they're problem solvers, they're incredibly adaptive, they're highly resilient, they're disciplined, they're bringing home technical skills. They've got leadership that they've learned, incredibly gritty, and they're able to make decisions under stressful conditions. So this is absolutely the perfect mixture for civic leadership. But as folks transition out, they leave. When you consider that 80% of our, enlisted veterans are 80% of our veterans are former enlisted, they come out of a very structured society, that being, kind of high school, and they go right into the military, as most young men do when they enlist, and young men and women, they go right into the military, where it's also very structured. And then they come out, and the military just kind of says, here's your transition package. Go get a job, or here's your GI Bill, go get an education. And folks have no idea how those unwritten rules apply in civilian society. So they're way behind. They've lost their tribe. They've lost, in many cases, their sense of purpose. And so what can happen, not always, but what can happen, is this starts a cycle of depression, of trying to figure out where I fit in, how do I fit in. It can lead to then kind of a spiral of all the classic stereotypes that we assume our veterans all have. And that's, alcohol and substance abuse, spiraling into homelessness, depression, suicidal ideation, and in the worst case scenarios, suicide, highly volatile, the list goes on and on. But I think Warriors Ascent and the Courage Foundation both believe very strongly that while there is such a thing as post-traumatic stress, there is certainly such a thing as post-traumatic growth. And that's what both of our organizations are focused on. So it's great work. It's rewarding work. I love supporting the Courage Foundation and supporting Mark Devine in these endeavors. And I know Mike's got a lot of good stuff to say about Warriors Ascent, who is probably our closest partner in this space.
Thank you. It sounds like you really recognized so many skills that active duty folks have, and then transitioning into civilian life, like you said, is being thrust into a different world. And so I, for one, am very grateful that you've reconnected with folks in order to create these spaces and opportunities for folks to find safety again in their lives. So Mike, would be great to hear from you about how you got involved in these organizations yourself.
No, absolutely. I mean, so much of what Sid laid out, I'll say, resonates with me, with, my experience, our approach at Warriors Ascent. So, just backing up a bit. So I retired in 2015 and had I'll say, a government service job lined up. And former boss of mine, Special Forces Colonel, was like, hey, I've got an opportunity for you if you choose to, accept it. And it's the, I'll say, the executive directorship of Warriors Ascent, a then fledgling nonprofit that helps veterans and first responders with PTS. I'd always had some entrepreneurial leanings. So I was like, what a great opportunity, really a great mission. I get to flex some, again, entrepreneurial skill sets, continue to serve. And, it was just a great opportunity. No, so, I'll say I jumped at that. That was in 2015, 2016. So now almost 7 years later, we just had our 55th cohort, or class. We call them cohorts, but, I know the SEALs, I think they'll call them training evolutions, right? So our 55th training evolution, right? 500 plus people, served and helped. And again, I don't want to oversell it, but a great many will tell us that, hey, this program saved their lives. So I take great pride in that. So our approach, just very briefly, and not to give you the shameless sales pitch, but we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization that helps veterans and first responders with PTS, post-traumatic stress. We empower our participants to take ownership of their lives and healing. So I would say, very much like Courage Foundation, that empowerment piece is very, very important. And for me, in my capacity as a former Special Forces officer, I like the building partner capacity model. So you can give a man a fish, or a woman a fish for that matter, or teach them to fish, and teaching people to fish much better, more sustainable. So, we used to say in the Special Forces that we endeavor to work ourselves out of a job. And that's what it is that we're trying to do, is provide people the skill sets so that they're not beholden, I'll say, to us in perpetuity. Not that we're not there for them. We've got a very established community, of people that, as again, what Sid was teeing up, tribe, that sense of tribe is so important. And for those that separate from the service is oftentimes lost. We try to, at least, I'll say, fill in that gap where applicable. But bottom line is providing those tools so that people get on the path to healing. We, again, liken ourselves to, I'll say, military, army pathfinders, right? We can't walk the path for you, but we can show you the path. And that's, very, very important. And as Sid, again, teed up with, Mark's approach, we like to say he conquers who conquers himself. That first and foremost, you've got to take care of yourself. You've got to master yourself. Once you've done that, hey, then you can conquer the world. But if you're not catering for your own needs and taking care of yourself, you're not doing anyone any good. Again, as we talked about with veterans, and in our case, first responders as well, putting your own needs, I'll say, up front is anathema to a lot of, to the way that a lot of our, I'll say, constituency has done work. In the past, it's like, no, hey, others first, lead by example, et cetera, et cetera. But, we like to say that if you're not taking care of yourself with the requisite self-care practices, you're not doing anyone any good. You're not really showing up as your best self. And I mean, that's absolutely critical to, really, I'd say one of the things that we do is give people license to take care of themselves and cater for their own personal needs. And I'll say for some, that's a real paradigm, a paradigm shift, in that, well, it's okay for me to go and take care of myself and do what I need to do. It's like, yeah, absolutely. So, in terms of
into a new world.
that is exactly it. Yeah.
Yeah. I had an interesting observation in the world of mental health. I'm a therapist. People often speak of trauma, and when they're referencing diagnoses, you hear folks saying post-traumatic stress disorder, but I noticed you're leaving out disorder. So I did want to check in with you. Language can be very powerful. So I'm curious about your thoughts and what your approach is when you choose, because I think that's a choice not to say it that way. So was hoping to hear some of your thoughts on that.
No, absolutely. I'll be brief, and then I'll give Sid the floor. But no, that is by design. That is a I'll say concerted decision, because we don't like the stigma disorder. Now, I know the VA, it's a very clinical description. So for grants and stuff like that, hey, PTSD. But for us, we like to think of it more as, hey, you're dealing with post-traumatic stress, and removing that stigma of disorder. And I know Sid mentioned post-traumatic growth. It's this notion that, hey, this quote unquote disorder does not define you. It does not cap, where it is that you can go. You can move beyond that. You can grow from that. And yeah, I mean, that is the way we perceive it. That's the way that we speak to it. And you're right, that is by design.
Yeah, absolutely. I was back in DC when a lot of this transition in the language was taking place, because the narrative was exactly that I described earlier. And I was working in the nonprofit space, serving veterans back in Washington, DC. And the thinking became, we're stereotyping these veterans, and people say thank you for their service and then kind of move away because of these, preconceived or stereotypes that are promulgated by, the narrative at the time, early, to mid 2000s and up into, 2010, 2011. And actually, it was Secretary of Defense Robert Gates who started veering away from putting the word disorder at the end of PTS. And that was strategic, just as Mike pointed out, because once somebody's labeled with a disorder, how do you now they're a problem child. Whereas, we prefer to think of things, and I think the veteran space, whether you're talking about Student Veterans of America or Team Red, White, and Blue or Team Rubicon, the mission continues on and on and on. There are a lot of these nonprofit organizations, post 9/11 nonprofit organizations, or the GWAT generation, Global War on Terrorism generation. And a lot of this was being driven at the time by Got Your Six, that we've got to change that narrative. And so, the PTS became kind of the term to use. And then when you've got organizations like the Courage Foundation and Warriors Ascent, we're focused exactly on what, Mike said, and that's starting with the individual, but then building a skill bridge from military service back into civilian society, so that this incredible generation of veterans with all the skills and attributes I mentioned earlier can become, and I believe this is true, that they can become and will become, with the proper supports, the next greatest generation. We all think of the World War II group as the greatest generation. Tom Brokaw coined that phrase, in his writings many years ago. But this is an amazing bunch. They've got an incredible proclivity towards service. And all we've got to do is help with that transition, help them master themselves so that they can, again, begin to serve others. And America needs these folks to continue to serve. And hopefully, Warriors Ascent and the Courage Foundation are providing that pathway forward.
Thank you. Well, I see myself changing the way that I'm describing things going forward. So I really appreciate that, because same in mental health, language is shifting all the time, and it's important to meet the needs of what people are actually going through, instead of, keeping them back into a place where they can't get better. And, Sid, you mentioned earlier some of the mental health struggles that come up for folks probably in active duty, but very much for veterans that are transitioning back into civilian life. And I was wondering, in more like simple speak, so maybe not just the terms of depression, substance use, anxiety, these kinds of things, but what are some other common struggles, just everyday struggles, that you would say veterans are facing when transitioning back to civilian life?
I think one of the biggest ones, Hesse Joe, is, was mentioned just a little bit earlier by Mike, and that is the reluctance, to talk about yourself. And so as a result, and I mean, part of this, comes with just, being in the military and the way the military is structured, especially as it relates to uniforms. You have these colored ribbons that are above your left pocket, and that's your resume. And anybody can look at that and they can tell where you've been and what you've done and how you've been rewarded for doing so. And so it is absolutely, unacceptable in military circles to talk about yourself. You talk about the team, you talk about your guys. Leaders eat last, and you take care of the guys first. If the platoon messes up, that's my fault. If the platoon does really, really well, that's the fault, that's the result of the guys and their hard work, and the guys and gals and all the heavy lifting that they're doing. And so you come out of that environment, and then you try to write a resume, and you try to go through a job interview, and you're not having any success, and because you don't understand the language, you don't know how to talk about yourself. And what kind of training do we get? I'm going to show my age a little bit, because I've been retired for about 19 years. But when I retired from, the Navy, my transitional training from the Department of the Navy was basically, you know, don't wear your khaki uniform pants to a job interview. You can't put a sport coat on top of your khaki uniform pants and have that pass. You know, go out and get yourself a nice suit, you know, and don't wear your core frames, which are your black uniform dress shoes. Don't wear those to an interview. And it kind of ended with that. And there wasn't a lot of training. And so I know that, you know, when I transitioned out, you know, I was fortunate. I had a college degree and, you know, so I could figure it out a little bit better, but I was still very, very lost and quite a bit befuddled, you know, for that first 12 months. And I decided to go back to school and go to graduate school and start working toward a PhD, which gave me a focus and was a tremendous transitional, you know, skill bridge building, you know, kind of a thing for me. But, you know, that's, you know, that was kind of a heavy lift. We were fortunate enough that I could go do that. By that time, both of our sons were grown and out of the house, so we were empty nesters. You know, you take a junior enlisted guy, he doesn't have that luxury, or she doesn't have that luxury. So they need those extra supports. And that's where I think Warriors Ascent and the Courage Foundation can plug those holes and help build that skill bridge that I referred to earlier.
Sounds like you've really pulled from your own personal experience and what you had waiting for you on the other side, which I'm hearing a lot of importance about a support system. And I think we all know that many folks coming out of the military don't necessarily have that in place. So, you know, I don't know if there's any other struggles, Mike, that you wanted to add, or if that kind of captured everything. I'm sure it didn't capture everything, of course, but any other struggles that you've noticed that are common with veterans?
Well, I think Sid touched on a lot, but it's, you know, I'll call it, you know, the military organizational culture per se. You know, there's a certain set of norms and ethos and all of that. And if you've got young, I'll say first termers where, you know, as Sid pointed out, they come right from high school, boom, they go right into the military, which is common. They've spent a good part of their adult life, you know, or at least the formative years of that in the military, you know, so now I'm not going to say they've become institutionalized per se, but that's what they know. Then you got a guy like me and Sid, you know, two retirees. I spent the entirety, maybe not the entirety, I'm not dead yet, but, you know, quite some time, you know, 22 plus years in the military. You get out in the civilian world and, you know, you're thinking that, all right, these are the values, these are the norms, this is that. And when that butts up against reality, I know it's very frustrating for a lot of our veterans. That's what they, you know, they share with us. The other thing that I'll say, and again, Sid did a great job of you know, I'll say metaphorically, you know, talking about, you know, the ribbons. All right, hey, I see what you're about. You know, the SEAL Trident in his case, right? And for us, you know, Special Forces Ranger, blah 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 blah. You give a glance and you're like, I know what this guy's been through. I know what he's done, and I get a decent sense of his pedigree and level of competence. You're out in the civilian world, you don't have that. So, and it goes both ways. One, you don't know what the other people are about. And number two, and this is what I'll say to our guys, and even though I'll say, you know, vocational placement and stuff isn't really our major charter, we still have these discussions anyway, because it is a point of, I'll say, contention and stress. It's this notion that if you think that the civilian world understands, I'll say, your personal value proposition, like in other words, they know, okay, you were a Green Beret, you were a Navy SEAL, you were, you know, an 11 Bravo infantryman, squad leader, platoon leader, whatever it might be, that people automatically understand the level of responsibility and stress and everything that goes into performing that job. I mean, if you think that most people outside of the military understand what that entails, you're wrong. You know, and I know that's frustrating. It was a little bit for me, you know, you're like, and what Sid was talking about in terms of in the Army, they call it, you know, soldier for life transition assistance. And it's gotten better, but I laugh because we did our MOS, or military occupational specialty, right? Which is what it is that you do. So 18 Alpha, you know, Special Forces officer. When they did the MOS mapping to say, hey, what kind of job are you, you know, highly qualified to do? They mapped that all out, and it's like, you can be a security guard. And it's just like, So I'm like, hey, I don't mean to be an elitist snob, but I got a little bit more training. I've got loftier ambitions given my, military pedigree, than to just be, and I'm not taking away from security guards by any stretch, but it's just like, hey, listen, and if that is our own military, and our transition assistance program saying, hey, we're going to do this,
Uh-huh.
you know,
It's like everybody's speaking English, but it's different languages. And you've both helped me really paint a picture of how this can really be detrimental to somebody's mental health and wellness, because your whole way of connecting with other people, your whole way of relating with the world around you and navigating this existence, it changes as soon as you're out. Your understanding of who you are in the context of other people, completely different. And I can now better really understand how important it is for folks coming out to have a landing pad of a community of people that understand this, because I could very easily see somebody, to not take these words lightly, but losing their mind over this kind of thing. This is not an easy transition. It doesn't sound at all. And I was wondering if either of you could talk a bit more about the current narrative we hear about veterans. You kind of touched on stereotypes that people have, or even preconceived notions. Maybe that's from movies, from media, from things that they've made up over time, and how it's so important to change this narrative.
Well, I think I think the current narrative, started, and once something starts, it's very difficult to walk back from that. But it was started by people that cared a great deal about our servicemen and women after 9/11, and especially after the invasion of Iraq, when folks were coming home in flag draped coffins, which this nation really hadn't seen since Vietnam. And so a lot of people jumped in, wanted to help. I think at the peak of combat operations back home, there were over 47,000 veterans facing nonprofit service organizations, and they all meant really well. But they're all out fundraising, and they're fundraising on the narrative that we've got to help these guys because they're so broken. And so I think General Mattis put it very well in a speech that totally went viral among the veteran community while he was Secretary of Defense, and that was the public began viewing veterans, and by that point had manifested itself. So the public was viewing veterans as damaged goods, and you thank them for their service, and now it's that poor guy or that poor young lady, she's been through so much, and that manifests itself inside the individual. They're having trouble transitioning. They don't know the unwritten rules of, as you referred to, Hesse Joe, communication, the unwritten rules of civilian culture, because they've been so embedded in the military culture. And so then that creates self-doubt, and then we start that spiraling process. Some people spiral in a lot further direction, unfortunately, than others, but still, you've got this narrative, and they start believing it. And one of the things that General Mattis said is, veterans don't buy into that. And that's what Warriors Ascent and the Courage Foundation are really all about, is trying to push back against that narrative and help civilian society see that these guys are really civic assets. These guys are really civic assets. They're not damaged goods. A little bit of help, a little bit of support, a little bit of skill building, and now you've got a civic leader.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's reminding me of a lot of research that's been done in K through 12 education. It's replicable that if you tell a student over and over that they're a bad kid, and they keep getting punished because they happen to be very talkative, they like to joke around, eventually this bad kid will turn into a student that is failing their courses, because they have, like you said, turned that narrative into something more internal. They've internalized it, adopted it as their identity. So I can understand it being extremely important to change the narrative around folks, seeing veterans as a monolith and thinking of them as one kind of person that's experiencing the same thing. It's clear that, everybody, of course, you still maintain the aspect that makes you you. So Mike, and I apologize, I was pronouncing this incorrectly before, but at Warriors Ascent, I understand that you're providing a 5-day program that runs 6 to 8 times a year, empowering your attendees to heal and tend the mind, body, and soul. That sounds really, really great. But what does that mean? Can you talk about what that looks like? And what are some of the benefits that you've been seeing through this program?
No, absolutely. I'd be happy to do so. No, so I know it sounds like like a lofty ambition, like, oh, come on, please. But I will tell you, in 5 days, I will never oversell it and say at the end of 5 days, ominous, dominus, you are healed. Spread the magic pixie dust and your life is a cloudless sky. That's clearly not the case. But as I said before, I like to think of it as us being the pathfinders and putting people on the path to healing. So really, what does that look like? On day one, I'll call it the metacognitive day. As a clinician, you understand what I'm getting at with that. So what we're setting up are the cognitive behavioral rubrics, right? So we'll use Daniel Kahneman's thinking, fast and slow. We'll talk about system 1 and system 2 thinking, right? And why that's important. And I'll say an epiphany for some is this notion that so much of your life is governed by system 1, which we know to be your automatic thoughts and I'll say routinized habits and things of that nature, things that are almost at the subconscious level. And more often than not, that saves you. It's survival or energy conservation. You don't have to think every move or every shift of the knob as you're driving to work. The downside is when those patterns of behavior do not serve you. You fly off the handle at somebody, your loved one or whatever it might be. System 2, logic and reasoning. Your more rational thought. The only thing that can reprogram system 1 is system 2. So we invite people's attention to that. We have them think about the things, the recurring patterns and trends in their lives that are just subverting their efforts to live, I'll say a good, wholesome, and peaceful life. And you see the lights turn on, they're like, wow, holy cow, you're absolutely right. The other one is going to be causal chain, antecedent, belief, and consequence, from cognitive behavioral therapy. So antecedent, both distal and proximal. So we kind of talked or touched upon some of the childhood stuff, in the conversation, but your distal antecedents are things that happen to you in childhood that form these patterns of thoughts and beliefs about who you are. I mean, you just mentioned it. Hey, you talk too much, you're not a good student. You talk too much, you're not a good student. After a while, those distal antecedents become these ingrained patterns of belief. And, now you're more proximal, your proximal triggers trigger that belief as well. And next thing you know, you're actually, I'll say, geez, what is the word? You're living up to that potential, as low as it might be. But those are some other, I'll say cognitive frameworks that we use in order to really get people thinking about their thinking, and the other thing too is, your thoughts drive your emotions, drive your actions. And there is a little bit of back and forth. But so many times it's just like, hey, the way you're feeling, the way you're acting, there are thoughts that really underpin all of that. And you really need to be more cognizant of those thoughts that are driving those emotions and behaviors. So that's first and foremost on Monday. And that is the framework with which we have them experience the rest of our program. The latter days are really self-care. So meditation, mindfulness, and I know, Mark Devine is a big fan of the meditation and the mindfulness approach. We talk about nutrition and, and the fact that you've got more neurotransmitters in your gut than you do your head. So nutrition is more than just aesthetic and physical performance. Sleep, et cetera, et cetera. Wednesday will be what I'll call cathartic activities. So that's letters to the dead, ceremony for the dead, wherein for some of our participants, letters to people maybe they killed in the line of duty. But it's also death and loss, it's forgiveness, it's letting go, and so many of our participants have just had horrible experiences, either in early adulthood or even childhood that has plagued them and followed them all through their adult life that, they endeavor to let go of. Leap of faith, I won't go into all the details, but they ascend a 40-foot pole, so it elicits a definite physiological response for those that have jumped out of airplanes. When you're at that height, you feel that rush of adrenaline. But bottom line is, before they ascend the pole, we'll ask them, what is it that you're leaping towards? What is it that you're letting go? And then they come down to the embrace of a supportive community. And having now seen it 55 times, it is transformative. I'll say it's somewhat inexplicable, the impact of that particular event. And then, the rest is community, is just being around others like themselves. So many participants say, hey, I've seen counselors, I've seen clinicians, I've been to therapy, and it's great and it's helpful. But there's something about being with a tribe of dudes or dudettes that have shared experiences and backgrounds that they can relate to. And I'll distill it into really two notions. One, it's this notion that they are authentically heard and understood, that someone in the audience, their brothers or sisters, really truly understands where they've been from. And no offense to any clinicians, but it's one thing to have the school training and go, okay, I understand, but it's altogether different to have somebody say, yes, I've been there, I know what you're going through. That's one. The less intuitive one, number two, would be, you've got a lot of alpha males and females that they may not say it, but they're like, if I were tougher, if I were better, I wouldn't be feeling this way. The reason I'm suffering, the reason I'm hurting is because I'm not tough enough, I'm not good enough. And when they're around other people like them that are sharing, I'll say, similar feelings, they feel validated and vindicated, that they're like, oh my God, I'm not alone, I'm not isolated, I'm not the only one. And that in and of itself is cathartic and powerful as well.
Where do I sign up? I mean, so much of what you've described would be so helpful for any person. I think you've really condensed so much of what happens in therapy for anybody into a really, brief program. And I can imagine it being transformative. Like you said, when you used that word, I got chills, believing myself, like, of course this would be transformative. This is like, slamming in sometimes 5 years of therapy into 5 days. And I imagine a lot of the folks coming through this program, they had these mental health concerns going into the military. Like you said, I think you kind of touched on this before. So many people out there outside of military too have unaddressed things going on with their everyday lives, where you're generally not thinking about your thoughts, the metacognition, like you said, where you're generally not making the connections between these antecedents in your life and how that plays out in your behaviors with your loved ones. So, Sid, similarly, the Courage Foundation is educating, equipping, empowering veterans living with PTS with skills, with resources and training to thrive. So can you tell us a bit about how this is implemented, and what are you seeing as some of the biggest needs for veterans and what really helps them thrive?
Right. So our approach is very similar to the approach of Warriors Ascent. But, for us, ours is a year-long program. There is a get-together seminar on the front end, and 12 months later, a get-together, retreat on the back end. And the great thing about ours is that those that have finished the 12-month program that are departing are co-located and mingling with those that are coming in for the next 12 months. So that's the model. It all starts with the physical. Mark Devine likes to refer to it as the physical mountain. So many veterans, in so many instances, have pushed their bodies really, really hard, and when they get out, it's really easy to grab that tub of ice cream and let yourself go a little bit. And if you're having trouble transitioning, that letting yourself go can compound itself. Many of us experienced this during COVID when we were in the lockdown scenario. I think they would joke about the COVID-15. People were gaining weight and they were drinking a lot more. And these weren't veterans. This was all of us. We're doing this. So for us, it's like, we got to get ourselves back in shape. That's the first thing. And then, to Mike's point, conquering that mental mountain. So conquer the physical mountain, get yourself back in shape. And now we're going to conquer the mental mountain. And that is understanding how your brain works, being aware of what you're thinking and why you're thinking it, so that you can kind of step back and go, okay, I'm feeling this, I'm thinking this, here's what's happening, and being able to push back against that. Then the next big hurdle is the emotional mountain. And these aren't necessarily taken one and then mountain two, and then mountain three. It's all working together. But the emotional mountain is learning breathing, relaxation, whether it's triangle breathing or box breathing, so you can get yourself kind of back under control when those emotions start spinning up. And again, you're aware of those emotions rather than let them just, flood you. And then the spiritual mountain, listening to your intuition. Some people approach spirituality in different ways. So it's not necessarily all about religion, but a lot of people gravitate toward religion. So get yourself right spiritually as well, intuitionally. And then once you've mastered these mountains, the physical, the mental, the emotional, the spiritual, or the intuitional, then we work toward being at a place that Mark calls kokoro, which is a Japanese term meaning the type of awareness where your heart informs your mind, which leads to your actions. So it's master yourself so that you can serve others. Master yourself and serve others. And then once our folks, after 12 months of this program, go forward with focus not on themselves, but on others, to borrow a word from Mike, it's truly transformational. And we've built a tribe, and they all stay connected, and it's a really, really powerful program.
It sounds powerful. It sounds beautiful. I mean, I keep getting this repetitive thought in my mind of like, how wonderful would it be for us as a people to be able to offer this kind of program to all people? There's so many people that need everything that you're talking about. These mountains are struggles for so many people, and I could see them just being compounded, like you said, with all the changes in reality, really, for a lot of people transitioning out. So I really wanted to thank you both for sharing more about these, really stellar programs that I'm myself feeling excited about to share more about this to other people as much as I can, to share the word. I think all of us here probably know at least one veteran that would benefit from at least learning about this stuff, thinking about these things a little bit more. So, we mentioned, of course, that this Friday, November 11th, is Veterans Day. And I know both Warriors Ascent and the Courage Foundation are rallying together with Burpees for Vets. So I was wondering if you could tell us, what is Burpees for Vets? I'm sure a lot of people know burpees. And how can people watching get involved other than doing some, I guess, at their homes?
I would love to tell you about Burpees for Vets. So Burpees for Vets started with Mark Devine, and part of the physical mountain. He wanted to bring awareness to the average 22 suicides a day, military veterans. And so he set this really ambitious goal and challenged his tribe to do 22 million burpees over the course of a year. And it was Burpees for Vets, and that's how Burpees for Vets, was born. And so what we did is we took Burpees for Vets and we partnered with For Purpose, a dynamic young organization, with forward thinkers. And we've kind of repackaged it so that it becomes, rather than a tribe thing of doing 22 million burpees, it becomes an American thing. And what we're hoping to do is do for the month of November with Burpees for Vets, like Susan Komen and Komen for the Cure has done for the month of October. But basically, it's to bring awareness and raise funds to help veteran service organizations, impactful veteran service organizations that are focused on one of several areas in the transition space. And so that would be mental and physical health, education and workforce empowerment, and community engagement. So those are the three big categories. So Burpees for Vets has partnered with Warriors Ascent, other organizations, Team Red, White, and Blue, for example, that cover these different areas. I think Bunker Labs and the Honor Foundation are the other two. So a total of 5 this year. And we're, doing as many burpees as we can. We ask for donations at $1 per burpee. I'm approaching 1,000 at this point. I've raised $1,031 on my own Burpees for Vets page. So I've got a few more burpees to go between now and November the 11th. But that's kind of the concept behind it. We've got a lot of gyms across America. And I got to send a shout out to Paycom Corporation here in Oklahoma City. Their whole company got behind Burpees for Vets. So many thanks to AJ Griffin and Tara Steffens and Kyle Birdwell, who helped pull that off. But it was a great campaign. They did it for a week, and their employees did over 30,000 burpees, and the company matched, $1 for each burpee. So thank you for Paycom. But yeah, if go to burpeesforvets.org and sign up and commit to doing some burpees for vets on between now and November the 11th.
Sounds great. And work on cardiovascular wellness, your mobility, and helping a really awesome organization. And finally, where can people learn more about both of your organizations? You shared burpeesforvets.org, but what about Warriors Ascent and Courage Foundations? Where can we find you?
So Warriors Ascent, it's warriorsascent.org. Very easy.
Right. And we'll link that below.
And it's couragefoundationusa.org. couragefoundationusa.org.
Great. Thank you so much both for your time, for everything that you're doing out there. This is such a much needed service, and programs that you're both involved in, transformational. Like I said, I can't thank you enough on behalf, I'm sure, of so many out there that you've been part of saving their lives, like you said. So that's really monumental. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Appreciate you.